Snow swept in from the north like a living thing, swirling and clawing at the battered rail station. The air bit through wool, sharp enough to sting skin and freeze breath in the lungs. The platform boards were slick with ice, and the sound of the departing train's whistle still hung thin and lonely in the air as it vanished into the white horizon. Linda Whitford stood alone, clutching her carpetbag so tightly her knuckles ached. The Dakota Territory in winter was far harsher than anything she'd imagined from her tidy boarding-house room in Boston. The stationmaster, an elderly man with red cheeks and a gray scarf wound around his throat, gave her a brief, uncertain glance before retreating back inside the office to warm his hands at the stove. He hadn't offered more than a polite nod when she arrived, and now he seemed determined to let the storm do all the talking. A gust of wind nearly knocked her sideways. She braced herself, teeth chattering, scanning the empty platform for any sign of her new husband, or rather, the man who had promised to be. There was no one. Only the hollow whistle of wind, the crunch of snow under her boots, and the distant cry of crows circling above the frozen prairie. The letter had been clear. Take the westbound train to Bismarck. I'll meet you at the station. You'll know me by the black hat and bay horse. Thomas Hale. But Thomas Hale was nowhere in sight. She fought down the first hot curl of fear. What if he had changed his mind? What if he'd never meant to come at all? A mail-order bride abandoned at the station. It was the sort of thing whispered about in boarding-house halls, but she'd never believed it would happen to her. She had been so careful, reading his letters over and over, tracing every neat, blocky word with hope. He had written like a man of conviction, a man who needed her. And she needed a home, a purpose, someone to belong to. A small voice broke through her thoughts. You look lost. Linda turned sharply. Standing near the edge of the platform was a little girl bundled in a patched wool coat, no more than 7 or 8 years old. Her cheeks were raw from the wind, and a knitted cap sat crooked on her head, covering hair as dark as midnight. In one mittened hand she clutched a wooden doll with no face, only a scrap of cloth tied around its head. I'm not lost, Linda said, though the words came out shakier than she intended. The girl tilted her head, studying her with serious, unblinking eyes. You're waiting for somebody. But nobody's coming. Linda stiffened. What makes you say that? The child shrugged. Been sitting here since morning. Saw every train come and go. Ain't no man in a black hat looking for a lady. She hesitated, then added softly, You hungry? Linda blinked, thrown by the question. What? You hungry? The girl held up a small paper packet, crumpled from her pocket. Inside were 2 cold biscuits. You can have one. I already ate mine yesterday. A lump rose in Linda's throat. That's kind of you, she said, crouching to the child's level. But you should keep it. You look like you need it more than I do. The girl shook her head stubbornly. You need a home. I need a mommy. That makes us even. The words hit Linda harder than the icy wind. For a moment she could only stare at the child, the storm swirling around them both as if the world had gone silent. What's your name? Linda managed at last. Clara, the girl said simply. You. Linda. Clara reached out and placed the biscuit firmly into Linda's gloved hand, as though sealing an agreement. Come on, Linda. You can't stand out here all day. I'll take you where it's warm. Linda glanced toward the empty road again, hoping, foolishly, to see a tall man on a bay horse, hat pulled low against the wind. Nothing. Only drifting snow and a sky the color of pewter. She took a steadying breath, tightened her grip on the carpetbag, and followed the little girl off the platform. The wind howled against the walls of the cabin, as if it wanted to claw its way inside. The lantern hanging over the rough-hewn table swayed with each gust, casting restless shadows over the pine plank floor. Linda Whitford stood near the doorway, still clutching her valise, her cheeks stung red by the cold. Take off your coat before you freeze twice, Samuel Garrison said gruffly. He hadn't smiled once since they left the station, and his voice carried that dry rasp of a man used to being obeyed. Linda hesitated, her fingers tightening on the worn handle of her bag. I'm not sure I should stay. Samuel's eyes narrowed. You're already here. The child needs you. From the corner near the stove, the little girl peeked out, bright-eyed, hair tangled from the bitter wind. Please don't go, Miss Linda, she whispered. It's too cold outside. You'll get lost. Something softened in Linda's chest. She knelt, unbuttoning her coat slowly. All right, she murmured, more to herself than to them. Just for tonight. Samuel moved toward the stove, shoving in another log, sending sparks up the flue. You'll find this isn't a fancy house. Roof leaks in the spring, doors rattle in the wind. But it's solid. Linda glanced around, a sturdy table, 3 chairs, a narrow bed tucked behind a curtain, and shelves lined with jars of dried beans and flour sacks. Sparse, but lived in. It's homey, she offered gently. Don't butter it up, Samuel muttered, setting out tin cups. It's what it is. The child slipped closer, tugging Linda's skirt shyly. Do you know stories? Mama used to tell me stories before the snow came. Linda swallowed hard. I know a few. She brushed her fingers through the girl's hair, noticing the way Samuel's shoulders eased slightly at the sound of his daughter's laugh. After supper, bread so hard it needed dipping and stew that smelled faintly of sage, Samuel stepped outside to check the barn, leaving the two of them alone. The cabin quieted except for the wind, now muffled by thick log walls. Do you miss your home? The little girl asked softly. Linda hesitated, then nodded. Very much. But sometimes life takes us where we're needed. The child curled into her lap without another word, her small body warm and trusting. Linda smoothed the worn blanket over her, and kept whispering bits of an old lullaby until sleep claimed the girl's lashes. When Samuel came back in, snow dusted his coat and hat. He paused when he saw Linda holding his daughter close, the lantern glow softening her tired face. For a brief moment, his stern expression faltered, something unspoken passing between them, not warmth exactly, but the fragile beginning of it. Best get some rest, he said finally, his voice quieter than before. Storm'll be worse by morning. Linda eased the sleeping child into the curtained bed, and lay down on the pallet Samuel had spread out near the stove. As the wind roared outside, she stared at the low rafters above her head, wondering what strange turn of fate had brought her here, to this lonely house, this solemn man, and this little girl with eyes full of hope. Morning broke pale and bitter, the kind of cold that makes the air feel sharp in the lungs. Snow drifted against the door in a white heap, and frost feathered the corners of the single window. Linda woke to the crackle of kindling in the stove, and the smell of coffee so strong it cut through the chill. Samuel Garrison stood by the fire, hat already on, coat buttoned to the throat. I've got to check the stock before they freeze solid, he said without looking at her. Stay inside. Keep the fire fed. Linda sat up on the rough pallet, smoothing her hair with numb fingers. Is it always this cold? In Dakota Territory? He gave a short, humorless laugh. This is mild. The little girl padded out from behind the curtain, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. Papa, can I go with you? No, his tone was sharp, but his eyes softened as he crouched to meet her gaze. You help Miss Linda. Keep her company. She doesn't know how to handle our winters yet. The girl nodded solemnly, then climbed onto the chair near the stove while Samuel stepped out into the icy morning. The door banged shut behind him, and the wind immediately howled through the gaps in the frame. Linda fed another log into the stove, grateful for the heat licking her fingers. What's your name, sweetheart? She asked gently. Mary. That's a lovely name. Linda smiled. How old are you, Mary? 6. Almost 7. The child said proudly, swinging her legs. Papa says I'm tough as a pine knot. I believe him. Linda's smile faltered slightly as she looked at the meager shelves, flour, salt, a few jars of beans. Doesn't look like you have much to eat. Mary shrugged, too used to it to complain. Papa makes stew. Sometimes biscuits if we have lard. By the time Samuel returned, boots crusted with snow, his beard rimmed with ice. Linda had swept the cabin floor and tidied the dishes. He noticed but didn't say a word, just brushed past her to hang his coat by the door. "You didn't have to do that," he muttered finally, nodding toward the clean floor. "I was here," Linda said simply. "I don't like sitting idle." Samuel studied her for a moment, something unreadable in his gray eyes. "You're not what I expected," he said at last. "What did you expect?" "Someone soft. Someone who'd turn tail and run at the first hard wind." He tugged off his glove. "But you're still here." Linda met his gaze steadily. "The train left. I didn't have anywhere else to go." Mary giggled from her chair. "Miss Linda's brave. Like Mama was." The words seemed to hang in the air. Samuel turned sharply, busying himself with the coffee pot to avoid meeting Linda's eyes. Linda felt a pang in her chest at the unspoken grief filling the small cabin. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the shutters. Samuel glanced toward the window. "Storm's rolling in. If you were planning to leave, you won't get far." Linda drew her coat tighter around her shoulders. "I wasn't planning to." Samuel gave a short nod, neither approval nor relief, just acknowledgement. But Mary's smile, bright and unguarded, felt like sunlight in the frozen room. The storm struck by late afternoon, turning the world outside into a wall of white. Snow drove hard against the cabin, rattling the window like handfuls of gravel. The wind moaned in the eaves, and the doorframe trembled as if some great hand shook it from outside. Samuel barred the door tight, shoving an extra plank across it for good measure. "This one's bad," he muttered. "We're staying in till it's over." Mary clapped her hands. "That means we can all sit by the fire." Samuel almost smiled, then hid it behind a sip of bitter coffee. "Yes, it means that." Linda was kneeling by the stove, stirring a pot of beans and salt pork. "How long do storms like this last?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "Sometimes a day. Sometimes 3, Samuel said. "You'll know when the roof starts creaking, that's when you pray it holds." Linda swallowed hard but kept stirring. The smell of cooking filled the room, rich and comforting against the cold gnawing at the walls. Mary sat on the floor with a rag doll, humming softly to herself. As night fell, the cabin grew dim except for the glow of the stove. Samuel lit a lantern and set it on the table. "Eat while it's hot," he said, ladling stew into tin bowls. Linda accepted hers with murmured thanks. The first bite burned her tongue but warmed her all the way down. "This is good." "It'll keep you alive," Samuel replied, eating quickly. "That's all food needs to do out here." Mary wrinkled her nose. "Mama used to make pies. Apple ones." Samuel's hand froze on his spoon. For a moment, only the wind howling outside filled the silence. Linda looked at him, then at the little girl. "I can make pies," she said gently. "If I can find apples." Mary's eyes lit up. "Can you really?" "I can try," Linda said, forcing cheer into her voice. Samuel pushed his bowl away. "Apples don't grow here. And even if they did, we couldn't waste sugar on something sweet." His tone was sharp, but Linda caught the edge of pain beneath it. "I didn't mean," she began. "I know," he said quickly, standing to busy himself with the stove. "Just don't promise the girl what can't be done." Mary looked down at her doll, quiet now. Linda set her bowl aside and reached for the child's hand. "I can't promise an apple pie," she said softly. "But I can promise I'll try to make something sweet when I can." Mary smiled faintly at that. Later, when the child had fallen asleep under a pile of quilts, Linda and Samuel sat in silence by the stove. The storm roared outside, pressing against the walls like a living thing. "You're good with her," Samuel said finally, eyes fixed on the fire. "She's a good child," Linda replied. "She just needs someone to talk to." Samuel gave a short, almost bitter laugh. "She talks plenty. I'm just no good at listening." Linda hesitated, then asked quietly, "What happened to her mother?" For a long moment he didn't answer. The wind howled and the lantern flame guttered. Finally, his voice came low and flat. Fever. Last winter. Nothing I could do. I'm sorry, Linda whispered. Samuel stood abruptly, as though the words themselves burned. Get some sleep. We'll need to dig out come morning. Linda lay awake long after he'd stretched out on his bunk. The wind screamed over the roof, but louder still was the ache in the little cabin, grief, unspoken and heavy as snow. The storm broke by morning, but the cold deepened, turning every drift into hard-packed ridges of white glass. The ranch lay quiet beneath its frozen quilt, the fences groaning under ice, the wind still carrying a thin, needling whine across the fields. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its orange light flickering against the rough-hewn walls, throwing long shadows that moved like restless spirits. Linda stirred first, her eyes opening to the dim gray light leaking through the frost-crusted window. For a long moment she simply listened, to the soft rasp of Matthew's steady breathing, to the muffled hush of snow settling from the eaves, to the creak of old timber shrinking in the cold. In the corner, Mary and the twins still slept, tangled in blankets, their small faces peaceful despite the night's bitter chill. She rose carefully, not wanting to wake them, and slipped into her boot. The floorboards bit her feet through the worn soles. As she pushed the door open, an icy wind cut through her shawl and made her breath plume white. Outside, the world was washed clean, sharp, glittering, dangerous. She saw Matthew already in the yard, his shoulders bent against the wind as he worked to free the barn door, snow piled high against it. Could have waited, she called, pulling her shawl tighter around her. He looked up, his face red from the cold, and grinned despite himself. And let the stock freeze? Not likely. Get back inside before you turn to ice. But Linda stepped down into the yard, boots crunching through the hard snow, and together they cleared the drift. The door finally gave way with a groan, revealing the warm, hay-scented dark of the barn, where the animals shifted and lowed softly in relief. They worked in silence, side by side, until their breath came fast and their cheeks burned. Later, with the chores done and the family gathered around the fire, the cabin filled with the smell of coffee and cornmeal cake. Mary sat close to Linda, leaning against her as though she'd always belonged there. Matthew glanced over from his chair, his eyes meeting Linda's in the quiet, unspoken way that had grown between them over these long, cold days. Outside, the land slept under its winter blanket, harsh and unforgiving, but inside there was warmth, fragile, hard one, yet real. As the wind rattled the shutters and dusk crept in early, Linda thought of the long road that had brought her here, of the whistle of the train vanishing into the white horizon, of the little girl who had taken her hand at the station and simply said, "You need a home and I need a mommy." For the first time in years, Linda felt something stir inside her chest. Not fear, not uncertainty, but the quiet, solid weight of belonging.